Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a long, slow walk through the fog of 16th century Hungary. So go ahead and dim the lights, find your most comfortable spot, and let's settle in. We're going to be talking about someone who has become a bit of a bedtime legend herself, though maybe not the relaxing kind, the Countess Elizabeth Bathory. You've probably heard her called the Blood Countess, or maybe you've heard the stories about her bathing in the blood of hundreds of young girls to stay young. But as we're going to find out, history is often much more complicated and a lot more boringly bureaucratic than the vampire stories suggest. We're going to look at her life not as a horror movie, but as a series of strange, tragic, and deeply dysfunctional events in a world where being a powerful woman was basically a crime in itself. So let's just relax and let the story unfold. Elizabeth was born in 1560 into the Bathory family, which was, to put it mildly, the 16th century equivalent of being born into a family of incredibly wealthy, slightly unhinged superheroes. They owned half of Hungary and Transylvania. They produced kings and princes. They also produced people like Elizabeth's uncle, Stephen Bathory, who was the king of Poland, and her other uncle, who was rumored to worship the devil, because, when you're that rich, you need a hobby. Elizabeth grew up in a castle called Exid, and from the very beginning, her life was a bit of a genetic lottery. The Bathorys were famous for their beauty, their intelligence, and their, let's call them, intense temperaments, because when you marry your cousins as often as the Bathorys did, you're bound to get some interesting personality traits along with the family silver. She was reportedly highly educated, speaking Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. This was a bit of a problem in the 1500s because a woman who knew more than her husband was often seen as a bit suspicious. At the age of 15, which was basically middle-aged for marriage back then, she was wed to Ferenc Nadasdy. Ferenc was known as the Black Knight of Hungary. He spent most of his time fighting the Ottomans, which meant he was rarely home. Elizabeth was left to run their massive estates, manage thousands of servants, and deal with the local peasantry. This is where the monotony of power starts to set in. Imagine being a brilliant, slightly bored teenager in charge of several massive castles while your husband is away decapitating people for a living. It's not exactly a recipe for a balanced social life. Elizabeth and Ferenc had several children, but Ferenc eventually died in 1604, leaving Elizabeth a very wealthy, very powerful, and very lonely widow. And this is where the stories start to get weird. According to the legends, the ones that would eventually be written down years after her death, Elizabeth began to descend into a sort of ritualistic madness. The famous story is that she hit a servant girl, and some of the girl's blood splashed on Elizabeth. Elizabeth supposedly noticed that her skin looked younger where the blood had touched it. So, naturally, instead of buying a nice moisturizer, she decided the best anti-aging routine was to drain 650 people of their life force and take a bath in it. Now, let's pause there for a second. If you're trying to relax, just think about the sheer logistics of that. Draining 650 people would take a lot of work. You'd need a lot of plumbing, a lot of cleanup, and a very quiet neighborhood. In reality, there is zero contemporary evidence that she ever bathed in blood. It wasn't even mentioned in her trial. That part of the story was added about 100 years later by a Jesuit priest, who probably just wanted to make the story more vampiric. But back in the 1600s, people didn't need bloodbaths to think Elizabeth was up to no good. They just needed her to be a powerful widow who owed the king a lot of money. King Matthias II of Hungary owed Elizabeth's late husband a staggering amount of debt. If Elizabeth were to be found guilty of, say, being a serial killer, her lands could be confiscated and the king wouldn't have to pay her back. It's funny how often justice in the Middle Ages aligned perfectly with not paying your bills. In 1610, King Matthias ordered Gurgi Thorza, the Palatine of Hungary, to investigate the rumors surrounding the Countess. Thorza was actually a relative of Elizabeth's, but in the world of high-stakes Hungarian politics, family meant you were just the person most likely to stab her in the back. Thorza claimed he caught her in the act during a surprise raid on Csészési Castle. He said he found one girl dead, one dying, and several others locked in the dungeons. But again, the official reports are a bit fuzzy. There were no lawyers for Elizabeth, there was no cross-examination. Instead, they arrested her servants, poor people who were tortured until they said exactly what the investigators wanted to hear. They confessed to all sorts of things: Elizabeth using needles, Elizabeth using fire, Elizabeth being a general nightmare. One servant even claimed the Countess had a book where she recorded the names of all 650 victims. This book has never been found, which is a bit of a recurring theme in Elizabeth's life. Lots of claims, very few receipts. Because she was a noblewoman, Elizabeth couldn't be executed or even put on trial in a public court. That would have been embarrassing for the other nobles. Instead, she was simply walled up in her own castle. They bricked up the windows and doors of her room, leaving only a small slit for food and air. She spent the last 4 years of her life in total darkness, listening to the wind howl through the Carpathian Mountains. It wasn't a dramatic end. It was a slow, quiet, monotone fading away. She died in 1614 at the age of 54, found by a guard who noticed her food hadn't been touched. So was she a monster or a victim of a massive political conspiracy? Probably a bit of both. It's likely she was cruel to her servants, most nobles were, and Elizabeth had a legendary temper. But the vampire stuff? That was likely the 1600s version of a smear campaign designed to take her money. And so, the Blood Countess remains a figure of shadow, a woman whose true face is hidden behind centuries of stories designed to make us shiver, even as we drift off to sleep. Let's float over to another royal disaster, one that's a bit less bloody, but much more genetically confusing. We're moving from the mountains of Hungary to the sun-drenched but very dusty palaces of Spain. We need to talk about the Habsburgs again, but specifically about a man who makes Charles II look like a marathon runner. We're going to look at the life of someone who was so productively inbred that his family tree was basically just a straight line. If Elizabeth Bathory represents the dark legend of royalty, Philip IV of Spain represents the slow, sleepy decline. Philip became king in 1621, and if you look at his portraits by Velázquez, you can see the weight of the world and the weight of his own chin hanging heavily on him. Philip wasn't a bad guy, necessarily. He loved art, he loved theater, he loved his many, many illegitimate children. He just wasn't particularly fond of, ruling an empire that was slowly falling apart. Philip's life was a long exercise in trying to stay relevant while your own biology is actively rooting against you. He was a Habsburg, which meant he inherited the famous Habsburg jaw or the Austrian lip. It wasn't just a facial feature, it was a badge of purity. The idea was that by marrying only within the family, they were keeping the royal blood clean. But as we now know, they were actually just concentrating all the worst genetic traits into one very long face. Philip's jaw was so pronounced that he allegedly had trouble chewing his food, which makes those long royal banquets sound less like a feast and more like a very tiring chore. Philip's first marriage was to Elizabeth of France. They had several children, but only one, Balthazar Charles, lived to be a teenager. Balthazar was the great hope of Spain, intelligent, handsome, for a Habsburg, and well-liked. But then, in a classic history is a cruel joke moment, Balthazar died of smallpox at 16. This left Philip without an heir and with a very broken heart. Now, a normal person might look outside the family for a new wife, but Philip was a Habsburg. He did what any responsible monarch would do. He married the woman who was supposed to marry his son, his own niece, Mariana of Austria. Let's just let that sink in for a moment. Mariana was 15. Philip was 44. She was his sister's daughter. To the Habsburgs, this wasn't creepy, it was just efficient. Why let a perfectly good alliance go to waste? But the genetic cost was staggering. Philip and Mariana had 5 children. Only 2 survived to adulthood. One was Margaret Theresa, the little girl in the famous painting Las Meninas. The other was Charles II, the man who would eventually end the dynasty, because his genetic code was basically 404 error not found. Philip spent his days in a palace called the Alcazar, which was famously dark, cold, and smelled of old wax and incense. He was a man of intense routine. He woke up, went to mass, met with his ministers who did all the work, looked at some paintings, and then went to bed. He was deeply religious and deeply guilty about his many affairs. He would often spend hours on his knees praying for forgiveness, only to go out and do the exact same thing the next night. It was a cycle of sin and sleepiness that defined the Spanish court. As the years went by, Spain lost its grip on Europe. The gold from the New World was running out, the Dutch were revolting, the French were invading, and Philip just sat in his chair, watching the shadows move across the wall. He became obsessed with death. He had a custom-made coffin kept in his room, and he would occasionally lie down in it to practice being dead. Talk about a commitment to the bedtime vibe. He even had the bodies of his ancestors exhumed so he could look at them, which is a level of goth that even Elizabeth Bathory would find a bit much. When Philip finally died in 1665, he left behind a kingdom that was a shell of its former self, and a son, Charles, who was so sickly he couldn't even walk until he was 4. Philip's reign wasn't a bang. It was a long, slow whimper. It was the sound of a giant clock winding down in a room where everyone has already fallen asleep. Let's float away from the dusty halls of Spain and move towards something a bit more aquatic. We're going to talk about a king who loved the water so much he tried to turn his entire life into a fountain. We're going to drift over to France, to the court of the Sun King, Louis XIV, but not the version you see in the history books. We're going to look at the weird, itchy, and very smelly reality of life at Versailles. So, we've moved from the dark, walled-up rooms of Hungary and the coffin-practicing kings of Spain to the brightest, most gilded place on earth, Versailles. If you're trying to sleep, just imagine the shimmer of thousands of candles reflecting off the hall of mirrors. It's all very grand, very gold, and, if we're being honest, very, very smelly. You see, Louis XIV, the Sun King, wanted to be a god on earth, but unfortunately for Louis, gods don't usually have chronic indigestion or a legendary fear of baths. Louis XIV is the ultimate example of a spoiled royal child who grew up to be a dysfunctional adult, but in a very high-class, choreographed way. He became king at age 4, just like our friend Edward VI, but Louis managed to live until he was 77. He spent those decades turning the act of living into a theatrical performance. Everything he did was a ceremony. There was a ceremony for him waking up, a ceremony for him putting on his breeches, and even a ceremony for him, well, using the royal clothes stool. But behind the silk stockings and the massive wigs, which he wore because he started going bald at 19 and couldn't handle the blow to his ego, Louis was a bit of a medical disaster. Let's talk about his teeth. or rather the lack of them. Louis's doctors believed that teeth were a source of infection, so when the king was in his mid-40s, they decided the best course of action was to remove all the teeth from his upper jaw, without anesthesia. The surgery went about as well as you'd expect for the 1600s. They accidentally broke part of his jaw and ripped a hole in the roof of his mouth. For the rest of his life, whenever the Sun King took a sip of wine, it would occasionally come back out through his nose. It's hard to maintain the aura of a divine being when you're literally leaking burgundy through your nostrils during a state dinner. But because he was Louis, everyone just pretended not to notice. That's the true power of an absolute monarch, the ability to make an entire room ignore a fountain of wine coming out of your face. And then there was his stomach. Louis was a legendary eater. He would consume mountains of pheasant, mutton, pastries, and fruit in a single sitting. Because his mouth was a mess and he couldn't chew, he basically just swallowed everything whole. This led to what we might delicately call explosive digestive issues. His doctors, who were obsessed with purging the body, made it worse by giving him massive amounts of laxatives every single day. Imagine the scene: the most powerful man in Europe, draped in diamonds and lace, constantly rushing to the velvet-covered toilet while his courtiers followed him to hear his royal thoughts through the door. It wasn't just dysfunctional, it was a marathon of discomfort. And because Louis believed that bathing was dangerous, doctors at the time thought water opened the pores to the plague, he allegedly only took about 3 full baths in his entire adult life. He preferred to be rubbed down with a cloth soaked in alcohol. So at any given moment, the Sun King smelled like a combination of old sweat, heavy perfume, and rotting meat. Let's float over to another disaster, this time in the cold, damp north. If Louis XIV was obsessed with his own image, Queen Christina of Sweden was obsessed with escaping hers. Christina became queen at age 6 in 1632. Her father, Gustavus Adolphus, had died in battle, and he had given orders that Christina should be raised as a prince. So while other little girls were being taught to embroider, Christina was learning to hunt, fence, and stay awake for 20 hours a day studying philosophy. Christina was brilliant, but she was also a bit of a chaotic mess. She hated feminine clothes and frequently wore men's boots and jackets. She never combed her hair. She called it a waste of time, and she was constantly covered in ink stains from her books. She invited the philosopher René Descartes to her court to teach her, but she insisted the lessons take place at 5 a.m. in a freezing stone library. Poor Descartes, who liked to sleep until noon, caught pneumonia and died shortly after. Christina essentially killed the world's most famous philosopher with her morning routine. But the real dysfunction came when it was time for her to marry. The Swedish government desperately wanted an heir. Christina, however, found the idea of marriage repulsive. She famously said, "I cannot bear the thought of a man using me as a farmer uses his field." Eventually, she got so tired of the pressure that she did the unthinkable. She abdicated. She gave up the throne, dressed as a man, and rode out of Sweden to live in Rome. She spent the rest of her life as a royal refugee, causing scandals in every city she visited. She turned her palace in Rome into a museum of weirdness, surrounding herself with alchemists, poets, and high-ranking cardinals. She was wealthy, eccentric, and utterly unbothered by what people thought of her. She was the spoiled child who decided to break all her toys and go play in a different sandbox. As we drift toward the end of our journey tonight, let's consider one last figure, someone who ties together the sickness, the spoiled childhood, and the sheer irony of history. Let's float back to England to look at Princess Charlotte of Wales. Charlotte was the only child of George IV, the son of the mad King George III we talked about earlier. Her parents hated each other so much that they only lived together for a few weeks, just long enough to conceive her. Charlotte grew up in a household that was essentially a war zone of passive-aggressive letters and screaming matches. She was the most important child in England, yet she was used as a weapon by her father to hurt her mother, and vice versa. She was a high-spirited, slightly chubby girl who loved dogs and hated her corsets. She was the people's princess long before Diana, a symbol of hope for an England tired of her father's gambling and her grandfather's madness. But when she married Prince Leopold and finally got pregnant, the medical wisdom of the time stepped in. Her doctor, Sir Richard Croft, was so worried about her having a difficult birth that he put her on a starvation diet and bled her constantly throughout her pregnancy. By the time she went to labor, she was exhausted and malnourished. She gave birth to a stillborn son and died herself a few hours later. The grief in England was so intense that it was said everyone in the country felt they had lost a daughter. Sir Richard Croft was so overwhelmed by the failure that he later took his own life with a pistol. The tragic irony: Charlotte's death paved the way for her cousin to take the throne. That cousin was a young girl named Victoria, the same Victoria who would go on to carry the hemophilia gene and spread it through the royal houses of Europe, leading to the collapse of the Romanovs. It's all connected, a long, slow, sleepy chain of events where a single doctor's mistake or a single genetic mutation changes the world while everyone's busy looking the other way. So, as the candles flicker out and the fog settles over the palaces of the past, we can finally let these figures go. The Blood Countess is silent in her wall, the Sun King's belly has finally stopped gurgling, and the Habsburgs are tucked away in their ornate, dusty tombs. The world is quiet now, the history is written, and you can finally sleep.